Good evening. I'm political editor Dennis Welch. This is Politics Unplugged, in the Attorney General's office this week announced that former AG Mark Brnovich had concealed evidence that his own investigators found that debunked claims of fraud in the 2020 elections. He claimed to find serious vulnerabilities, even though investigators said that wasn't true. Here to talk about that is Attorney General Kris Mayes. Thank you for being here very much. And let's start with how you went about getting access to these records. When did you start doing this, and why?
Well, you know, we were obviously curious, like most Arizonans, about whether the previous Attorney General had actually produced a final report. He had released an interim report that cast doubt on our elections. And so we went through a process, Dennis, of searching the systems at the AG's office, talking to investigators, talking to the folks who actually worked on this investigation, and uncovered these three reports that essentially came to the conclusion that our elections in Arizona were fair, are free, are secure, and that essentially completely absolved Maricopa County elections officials of any wrongdoing. So we thought it was important to get those out, and the people of Arizona had a right to know this information before 2022.
So obviously election fraud, baseless conspiracies of election fraud has really dominated a lot of politics in Arizona, in many parts of the country for the past several years. You ran against, someone in the campaign. There was a lot of accusations being thrown about in that. What was your immediate reaction when your people came back and said, we found all this stuff? It looks like the AG sat on all this information.
I mean, obviously, my immediate reaction was this is completely unacceptable. I mean, the top duty of the top law enforcement official of Arizona, which is the Attorney General, now me, and at that point, Brnovich, is to be honest and transparent with the people of Arizona. And think about what was going on at the time. He had in his possession three reports that essentially said that Maricopa County and the state runs elections properly, fairly, securely. At the same time, all of these conspiracy theories are raging. Our Democratic House was on fire. Mark Brnovich had a fire hose, but he chose to put it down and walk away. So obviously, it's unacceptable. And,
there's been a lot of reaction to this since this report has been released, a lot of angry people, some people calling for Mr. Brnovich to lose his license to practice law. Can you weigh in on that? Do you agree with someone like Adrian Fontes, who has said, he needs to be disbarred, the bar needs to look into this? What do you think should happen with that?
Look, I understand those sentiments, and I understand the anger, and I'm angry too. I'm upset, I'm disappointed, but I think my job as Attorney General was to put this information out there. I think it's up to others to determine whether this needs to go before the state bar. Ultimately, it could go before the state bar. Right now, I think it's time to turn the page. It's time to heal. It's time to come together. It's time to end this divisiveness. And my job as Attorney General is to restore this office to its core mission, which is fighting fraud, combating our fentanyl crisis, protecting our elections officials. We are going to do that. We are not going to do what happened under my predecessor, where they spent 10,000 man and woman hours on an investigation that never should have happened to begin with.
And considering we've seen a lot of threats against election officials, a lot has come out of these conspiracy theories. Do you think by holding on to this information, do you think maybe the state is exposed to any kind of legal ramification, civil or otherwise?
I mean, I think it remains to be seen. I think one of the saddest aspects and most outrageous, frankly, aspects of this is that we did have an election cycle, actually two, in which elections officials throughout Arizona were the subject of death threats, of threats of violence, of harassment and intimidation. We now have three counties, a third of the counties in Arizona, Dennis, that have experienced the resignation of a top election official because of these death threats. And so, clearly, this has got to stop, and it will stop under my administration. We are going to be truthful and transparent with the people of Arizona. And I want to be clear about this. I will prosecute anyone who engages in death threats against our elections officials.
And one of the things we did learn from the release of those records, it was under Brnovich, there was 10,000 hours worth of investigation. Obviously, not all the paperwork has been released, not all the documents and information has been released. Will there be more of that information coming out in the future?
There is. I mean, we actually have about at least 500 pages worth of information that we still have to redact. We've got to take identifying information out of. There will be additional releases of information, but the core information we provided, which is these reports, including the interim report that had the notes from our investigators essentially debunking my predecessor's findings, interim report. And I just want to say this finally, Dennis. I am so proud of the investigators at the Arizona Attorney General's office who did this investigation diligently and professionally, and they provided their honest findings to the AG, who unfortunately didn't then pass them on to Arizonans.
Yeah, and before we move on from that, you did bring up, this is a very key piece of information. There was a release, a report, a draft report that was put together, and you got a hold of suggested edits from Mr. Brnovich's staff, basically saying, like, this line here, it's not true, you should take this out, or debunking certain lines there. Maybe explain to our viewers exactly what that piece of information was.
So these were suggested edits and refutations by, and I want to be clear about this, these are the career agents, law enforcement agents and investigators at our office, 60 of them. We had 60 agents who at one point were involved in this investigation, and those edits were provided to the political leadership of the Attorney General's office, provided to Brnovich's staff, at the very least, top political staff, and they were not accepted. They were deleted from that interim report, and that interim report without their comments was released to the public.
Okay, and final question with this segment here. You said you want to restore the office. So obviously you're probably doing a top-down review getting into the office. My understanding is the transition between you and Mr. Brnovich wasn't very extensive. I understand he did hand you the keys. It wasn't a whole lot more than that. But what else are you finding as you're doing this top-down review, and what else can we expect to be made public here shortly?
Well, look, I mean, what I'm finding is that we have an incredible Attorney General's office ready to do the actual work of this office, which is combating our fentanyl crisis, combating consumer fraud, getting after and combating elder abuse. What we need to do also, Dennis, is repurpose that election integrity unit, the EIU, that really became a voter suppression unit, and we're going to use it to protect elections officials, protect voting rights in Arizona, and really get back to the core mission of the AG's office.
All right, I want to thank you very much, Attorney General Kris Mayes. Thanks for stopping by. And still